the magic happens, and of course it's a lot of work on the therapist, when people are able to put down their more defensive, protective emotions, right? Typically the anger or the tendency to just withdraw and not, be very detached, and to actually reveal their inner worlds to each other.
Hi, Catalina. So nice to see you again for an interview on emotion-focused couples therapy. It is a
Great.
pleasure to have you here again, and I would like to introduce you one more time for everyone who hasn't seen the first interview with you. Dr. Catalina Woldarski-Meneses is a clinical psychologist in private practice based in Lausanne, Switzerland. She has extensive training in emotion-focused therapy. She's published numerous academic papers on the topic of couples therapy and forgiveness, and she co-authored a book with Lester Greenberg on the topic. Catalina is a supervisor and trainer certified by the International Society for EFT. She's originally from Chile, grew up and studied in Canada, and now she lives in Switzerland.
That's right. Yes. So thank you, Ghazaleh, for inviting me for a second round or a second part to our conversation.
In the first interview, we started to talk about, how we actually get caught up in those cycles in relationships, right? And that so much of that has to do with our emotional experiences in our childhood, and certain experiences that are unresolved can get easily triggered in the relationship. And then we fight for those needs in specific ways. And then we kind of get caught up in cycles that are really difficult to break. In this interview, I thought it would be nice to actually focus on two typical cycles probably we both see happening in sessions. And you give our advice to the audience. How would you suggest for them what to do as a partner that is caught up in one of those cycles? And number one is that the typical cycles partners get caught up in is when one partner feels she is the only one reaching out to their partner and talking about difficult emotions, while the other partner pulls back and finds it really hard to talk about their feelings. So they start giving solutions. What would you suggest both partners that are caught up in this cycle?
So it's a classic cycle, right? As you're pointing out, and probably people who work with couples have seen this in all of its variations, right? So it can also take a more kind of intense form or manifestation where you've got one person who's trying to cling on to the other one, and the other one who's just like pushing the other one away, right? So cling and push away is a variant of that. But essentially what to do with this, I mean, so we definitely always start our therapy with trying to actually understand both partners' experiences through the lens of both attachment and identity. So we understand that people are doing the best that they can to try to get their needs for connection and validation met. And for some people, that actually takes the form of being in what we call the active pursuer mode. And that usually involves, trying to reach out to the other and seeing that their other isn't available, or that they don't quite get the response that they need. And so then they move into kind of more aggressive means to get their needs met. And that might actually take on the form of criticism or, proper attacks on the person. And so then what ends up happening is the other person is even more afraid to come out of their shell, right? And so we've got a complementary response pattern happening, right? That's what makes this cycle so difficult to work with, is that it reinforces both partners' position, meaning so the one partner who's trying to seek connection and initially does this perhaps in a gentle way, but then over time it takes on the form of a critical approach or attack. Then the other partner is trying to do their best to regulate their anxiety, right? And to manage their own feelings that are getting triggered. And so that can be a number of different things, but most typically it's a feeling of inadequacy, right? That the withdrawer feels. And so it's a sense of somehow feeling like what this other person wants, I can't give them, or feeling, it can also be an underlying sense of fear, right? Fear of being invaded. And so these sensitivities, they have to do with people's life experience, right? So if the withdrawn partner had very invasive parents, for example, right? The kind of the sense of having somebody so close and so persistent is actually, it's like they're allergic to that. It's there's something so uncomfortable about it that they manage the discomfort by going away. Another thing that also kind of a common experience is that of having that leads to withdrawing is also the fear of intimacy, especially if there's been trauma, sexual abuse that's happened in the past where the person was physically invaded, right? And so intimacy is threatening for different reasons. So it could be from an intimacy kind of invasive standpoint, or it could be also just for the sense of feeling pressured to respond to the other and feeling essentially unable to respond. So it brings up a sense of inadequacy, of shame, right? It's like, I'm not good enough to be in this relationship. I don't quite know how to handle his or her requests. I keep screwing up and it doesn't matter what I do. So I may as well just not even try, right? Because every time I do something, I just feel like a total loser, or like I keep getting it wrong. And then, my partner's exploding in rage. And so what we essentially need to do, obviously, is first understand what's going on from, as I said before, the perspective of attachment and identity, right? It's like these people are doing the best that they can to try to get these needs met. And then the second thing is we try to firstly understand this through the lens of a cycle, right? And so we identify, okay, so this is the position you take and this is the position you take. And then we help them kind of connect with the underlying feeling that drives the position. So something happens in both partners that leads them to do the thing they do. So the pursuing partner becomes very critical when he or she feels perhaps unsafe, right? Or insecure. And so it's going to be initially very important to start naming these underlying feelings, right? And then over time, we do more work with that and having partners reveal this vulnerability to each other, right? So having them really connect with perhaps the fear of being abandoned or the fear of not being good enough for the pursuer, and then for the withdrawer, usually it's the sense of feeling inadequate, incompetent, right? And that feeling of inferiority somehow, that they can't quite figure this out. And then that's what drives them to kind of pull away. You know, what we then do, right, at stage 3 and 4 is really insist on this vulnerability and help people connect with, the pain around it and reveal the pain to each other, and then have them be responsive to each other's pain, because this is actually what creates a transformation in their interaction, right? It's both the revealing and the being able to respond to the other partner's pain that is fundamental for the change to happen at a deeper level. And this therapy isn't about simply modifying behavior or having people just get along generally better or having their fights be less violent. It's actually about helping people to transform these really, maladaptive states and their behavioral ways of managing that are actually so damaging to the relationship. And so essentially, we've got to look at kind of the various pieces that go into that. So there isn't a clear set formula of like, okay, this is the one thing you do. It's part of a bigger process, right? And it happens also over time. But as we talked about in our first interview, certainly we need to have people take responsibility for their sensitivities, acknowledge them, express them, and then, as I just said, have the partner respond to them, because this is what's going to create the change. I mean, it's quite different to say, I go into I have to hide behind my wall because I feel inferior to you, or I somehow feel like I keep failing you, right? And to say that in a really genuine, vulnerable way, then it is simply to kind of shut down and not respond to the other part, right? So this is what starts to create change, right? And similarly for the pursuer to be able to talk about how, destabilizing it can feel when the other partner goes away, and how important it is to feel that he or she, matters to the other person, right? And has the feeling that they're in the relationship together, versus attacking the other and saying to him or her, you are so useless and you don't even know how to do emotions and there's something, deeply wrong with you. because that type of presentation obviously sets the other person up to get on the defensive and protect themselves.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the key element, as we mentioned also in the first interview, is talking about from those vulnerable places more. And that the hope behind it is once they reveal actually what they really feel underneath the attacking and withdrawing, connects them more and helps the partners to understand each other. And so they feel safer for the one that finds it difficult to reach out and start difficult conversations to actually reach out. And for the one who actually goes into the attacking and criticism mode to approach the partner in a softer way.
Exactly.
This is easier said than done. And often
Yes.
couples feel, okay, we do that in the therapy session because you're here and you help us to guide us to this place, right? But in the real world, for the person who's difficult to talk about their inner world, they still don't reach out when it comes to
Right. And so it's definitely not a kind of a magical, session where suddenly everything will fall into place. It's actually a process that happens over time. And it starts with these new experiences that are happening in the session. This is really important. I mean, it's an experiential therapy. So EFT is not about telling people what to do or instructing them to be, more vulnerable. It's the magic happens. And of course, it's a lot of work on the therapist when people are able to put down their more defensive, protective emotions, right? Typically the anger or the tendency to just withdraw and not, be very detached, and to actually reveal their inner worlds to each other. Very likely that they will revert back to their cycle. But when that happens, it's not in and of itself a problem. I mean, it's just a thing to deal with, right? It's just the nature of change, right? It's not uh, perhaps going to happen immediately, but when it does happen, and every time that they can get a sense of, oh, we were back in our cycle, there's kind of another layer of not just understanding, but I think also responsibility for what they're doing and the contribution they're making to the conflict, right? And so,
So it's
I think
both sides as well to acknowledge they both need to continue what we do in the sessions, also in the real world, although it's hard, but that both need to be really in this and to make sure they focus on their own vulnerabilities.
so part of it is definitely having people be aware of what they do, both in session and outside of session, right? But if it does happen that they have a really powerful session and, they both reveal vulnerability, and then they come in the next week and they're very distant or angry, and we get a sense that they've definitely gone back into their cycle, and we use that as an opportunity to understand, so what triggered the cycle, and what did you do, and what did you do, right? And what made it difficult to actually do the thing you did here last week? So I think vulnerability is underestimated in terms of how demanding it is, right? In terms of like the risk that one has to take, right?
I love the word risk because in that moment when I let down my guard, I'm really risking here something.
Absolutely, right? And it's like you really are so exposed and you feel partly naked and you don't know what's going to happen. And so if it doesn't feel safe, you won't do it, right? And so it actually is informative to work through these kind of, they're not necessarily relapses back into the cycle, but it's just the nature of change, right? That's two steps forward and one step back, right? And
I think that's important because, couples therapy, especially emotion focused couple, doesn't mean that you're never going to get caught up in cycles anymore. I mean,
right.
human beings, there are also external life circumstances and challenges on the relationship sometimes, right? So, which means more like we know now better how to get out of the cycle or be aware of that we're getting caught up in the cycle and create maybe even more positive moments rather than the cycle. But that doesn't mean that we want to help people never fight anymore or never get hurt anymore.
Exactly. And even after like we finish a therapy, right, and people are in a much better place and they're able to really understand each other and appreciate each other and respond to each other's pain and so on. I mean, I always say to people, and you should anticipate that you could potentially get back into the cycle because, as you were saying, Ghazaleh, there could be lots of things that may trigger each partner's, individual tendencies, right? To feel more insecure or to feel more inadequate, etc. And that um, I think what's really critical though is that each partner be able to understand and take responsibility for the ways that they manage
Mhm.
when these different sensitivities, their respective sensitivities get activated. So one of the classic questions at the end of a therapy is when we talk about relapse prevention is asking the couple, how would you get back into your cycle? So it's a kind of a paradoxical thing, right? People usually get a little bit, they're thrown off by that because it's like, no, we came to you because we wanted to do better and now we're doing better. And why are you asking about like, how could we revert back to, it is a form of regression, like to when we first came in here. But it's so important, I think, as a question, because it really highlights the sense of like how deeply have they appropriated this, right? Like how much have they understood about the cycle? And if they haven't fully, and they say, well, it's if she starts shouting at me, then I will hide in my, go back to my, into my shell or withdraw, right? That's actually not the answer. The answer is when I feel inadequate, I will go into my shell and then it will make my partner feel insecure and probably, he or she will be more active in trying to reach me.
Yeah,
To this
exactly. It
responsibility.
might come to my second situation
Mhm.
is that, we also have a lot of feelings about ourselves in the relationship. And sometimes
Mhm.
one partner struggles with shame and self-criticism or low self-esteem, and they feel unlovable and worthless. And the other partner feels powerless and hopeless and scared because they feel there's nothing they can do to make their partner feel better. So
Mhm.
they withdraw again or get lost in explanations. How would you work with that couple?
Yeah, so this is another classic kind of type of configuration, right, that can happen where usually the deep feeling of inadequacy and low self-esteem and just not being good enough, is the result of trauma or some, early life experience that left that person feeling inadequate and just not good enough. And so um, sometimes that wound can be so deep for this one person, right? That their partner opening up and saying, I need more connection or you're not there for me can be a trigger, right? And so that person then, with that kind of background and tendency to kind of collapse into a state of shame will go into that state of shame. And I like this term that Serene Warwer, one of my former supervisors, uses, and that is they go into the shame spiral.
Yeah.
I've adopted this because I love it because it's kind of like a vortex, right? It's like this person then, when we look at it in EFT terms, we understand that what's happening is that this person is actually having an experience where their primary maladaptive feelings are activated and it just takes them away from the here and now and they're back into that feeling of when they were 8 years old and being bullied at school or not having anybody at home to turn to and so on, and it's such an awful feeling that they kind of get stuck there. And then,
Not even listen anymore to the partner, right? As if like
that's right.
so
It's
lost
so
in a
awful.
shame spiral that it's impossible to actually hear, listen, and be available.
Yeah, exactly.
Partners to do when they have this trigger. Okay.
Okay. So then one thing that's actually really important is to frame it as such, right? That this is not about the partner abandoning the other, although it can feel like an abandonment for the other partner. Absolutely, right? And that's why this other partner feels so hopeless because typically what happens is the other partner is trying to be reassuring and trying to say, no, you're not that bad,
Mhm.
and so on. But it doesn't touch the pain and the deep feeling of just not being lovable, right? I mean, it's just a really awful experience.
Mhm.
And so in therapy, it can be extremely useful to find a term for that. So you can call it the shame spiral or this vortex, but somehow you, partner A with this background and history, you go into the state when you hear that you've somehow let her down or like she's saying to you, I need more connection. Part of it I'm summarizing obviously is like you'd have to explore, what happens internally for this person, but typically it's like it's a trigger for that. And then I think it's helpful, as I was saying, to give that a name, right? And that is actually part of what happens in their dynamic. And then it leaves this other partner feeling deeply alone, right? And quite hopeless. And so we need to help that person who's gone into this maladaptive state of shame regulate themselves, right? Or verbalize. At the very least, it's like a little flag for the other one to say, I'm unable to deal with this right now because I've gone into this state, right? And then ultimately, especially when this has been an ongoing therapy, right? And you've worked with the other partner to try to be responsive and it still doesn't quite bring them out of that state. I mean, it's actually very difficult when there is a kind of a really pronounced feeling of shame, right? The person's whole sense of self is constructed around that. The other partner's words don't quite, it's not like a soothing balm. It's just like, something that's said, but it doesn't penetrate. And so we would then move into doing self-soothing work, right? So this is actually something that happens much later in therapy. So stage 3 and 4, when people have already been, obviously they're de-escalated and they've been vulnerable, and we've seen both partners respond to each other in a soothing, loving way, and it's still this persistent tendency to collapse into shame, then we need to address the origins of this, right? And usually that is self-soothing work can take on the form, for people who are familiar with the individual or the EFT model for individuals, we have a number of different tasks that we do, right, to address both the relationship with the self, so self-critical splits, and then also with the kind of the self-other relationship, right? So obviously this feeling didn't just emerge, it emerged in a relationship with somebody in a particular context. So we usually would do unfinished business work, and the other partner would be observing this, right? So it's like individual based work with the other partner observing it. And then over time, as this person with the kind of tendency to collapse into shame has a bit more of a capacity to self-soothe and has done this work, right? They can now hear the other partner say, I feel lonely and I need connection, without collapsing into shame, right? And again, it's a progressive, is it something progressive that happens? It's usually not, like a one-time deal and now this person is completely open and able to hear their partner, right? There will always be a tendency to perhaps kind of go in that direction, but now they can be regulated enough so they can stay in contact with the other partner.
The self-regulation part is, as you say, an important part that people need to really also understand how to soothe themselves. It can be also available for the partner, right? Because it's frustrating for the other partner. Also difficult to see someone you love struggling so much.
Yes, right.
I mean, that's incredibly painful. At the same time, it's also scary. And, you might also feel, that's why I experience a lot with partners, that they feel like, can I fill this void? Right?
Exactly, right? And that's the big ask, because it's
partner. And so the partner sometimes might even withdraw. And that might even be an evidence or a proof for the partner, see, I am worthless and unlovable, because now feel like that, you withdraw, right? But
exactly. So it's self-reinforcing, right? And they just get stuck in the cycle.
and I hear like typically this is one of the moments when couples say we have different needs and too different, and are we actually compatible, right? You actually say people are not compatible.
Well, I don't take that position personally. It just doesn't fit with the way I work, right? So from a humanistic standpoint, it's like people, the underlying premise is people are the experts on themselves. I have an expertise in different things in terms of how we can work with different emotional processes, but ultimately I'm not the ultimate judge. So I would never say to a couple, the two of you are so incompatible, you should just get a divorce and go your separate ways, right? But the framing that we take in EFT is more around trying to understand, so what is blocking the connection, right? So what is happening from an emotional standpoint that is getting in the way of you getting the connection that you're seeking? right? And that can be anything, you know, these blocks to connection can be a feeling of deep insecurity, right? Like I don't quite know that my partner will be there. So what's the point of even opening up? I'm not sure that she's really that invested or that he's really that committed and he's got one foot in, one foot out. And so why would I take that risk? And then it can also be a little bit about, it could possibly be anger. It's like, I'm so, resentful about this thing that happened that, we've never acknowledged. And so it's like, I can't get close to him or her. And so all that comes up is anger. And
Yeah.
so, you know, just to go back to your question around compatibility, are all people
That
compatible?
because that's typically what couples ask, right? Do you
Yes.
think we're compatible? We're so different. I have this need for this closeness, and he doesn't seem to have that need or so.
Right, right.
And
So,
so,
yeah, no, I'm glad you raised that because it is absolutely true, right? Certainly people come in and say that. And, my position and what I say to couples is that, there are differences that exist in all couples. And in fact, that's actually what makes being in a couple in a relationship interesting and exciting. I mean, among other things, right? But it'd be very boring if you were with a person who was exactly like you. And, I would want to validate as well, like how frustrating it must be to want more closeness and feel like your partner doesn't. And so let's talk about essentially how you handle these differences. So the differences are not a problem. It's how people handle the differences that becomes problematic.
absolutely. A
Mhm.
beautiful way to end this interview, though, again and again, we can talk about this for ages.
Mhm.
Thank you for Catalina to give us such a beautiful, insight about how couples work on their dynamics in emotion-focused couples therapy. And so, can you give the couples one important advice when they get lost in their cycle?
Ooh. One important piece of advice when they get lost and they're activated in the cycle, right? I think it's really helpful, even though it's quite a leap, to remember that your partner's hurting, even if in the same way you're hurting, right? Because when we're in conflict, it just feels unimaginable that this other person would be hurting. And I think it opens the door, at least, to having some curiosity and hopefully empathy about the other's inner experience. So, I mean, essentially, it's like what you see is not all that's happening, right? It's like these two icebergs coming along, and you just see the tips of them, but you don't see the underlying, the big chunk that's under the water.
Yes.
And so, human beings in conflict are like that.
Thank you so much, Catalina. Greetings to Switzerland, and I hope to talk to
Thanks,
you
Ghazaleh.
again. Bye bye.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Take care.
If you find yourself in one of those cycles, I hope this interview was helpful for you and you enjoyed watching Catalina talking about those dynamics. And I hope to see you at my next video.